Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. It was just over 100 years ago that women won the right to vote with the addition of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. There were major Centennial celebration plans this past August, but the recognition was subdued because of COVID restrictions. Interestingly, Vermont's ratification of the Suffrage Amendment came 5 months later on February 8th, 1921. Better late than never. To unpack the suffrage movement in Vermont and to shed light on the importance of the movement on our lives today, we're welcoming two guests from the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance, Executive Committee member Sandra Dooley and historian Marilyn Blackwell. Thank you both for joining us via Zoom. And so, Sandy, why don't we start with you to tell us a little bit about the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance and its mission?
Hello, everyone. In 2018, the Vermont Commission on Women reached out to the League of Women Voters in Vermont and asked them to take the lead in celebrating the 100th anniversary of the suffrage amendment. The League said yes and organized a coalition. That coalition now comprises 20 individuals and representatives of 40 organizations. Sue Racanelli, the woman with the long scarf in the photograph, is the director of the Alliance. The Alliance has three primary missions. The first is to celebrate and honor and commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. The second is to educate Vermonters about the 72-year history of the suffrage movement and how racism and discrimination played a role in that movement.
All right.
And the third is to encourage people to vote and to essentially engage Vermonters in the ongoing quest for equal voting rights.
Excellent, and so important. And what has the Alliance accomplished so far, and how has the pandemic affected your goals?
Well, collaboration with these organizations has been pivotal. Many of them decided to organize events on their own. The pandemic meant that the Alliance, which had planned large events, a parade and a festival in Montpelier, had to be postponed and haven't taken place yet. The Central Vermont Runners organized a 5K run and walk called the Suffrage Scramble, and that became virtual. People chose their date, time, and place, and it took place during primary week. You can see some photos of that. Over 400 people attended. The Ethan Allen Homestead had planned an in-person symposium, and that was moved online. And finally, on the actual 100th anniversary in August, there were small events around the state in 10 different locations. And I think we have a photo.
Including Church Street.
Yes, of Church Street in Burlington, which has a banner that shows votes for women, votes for all. And this movement is really about, in addition to history, encouraging people to vote and making people aware of the barriers that still existed after 1920.
Right, and we do have a picture of that Church Street piece. And while we look at that for a minute, Marilyn, let's get to you and some of this history. Yeah, there it is. So, we tried during the pandemic to do some celebrating. But the Vermont ratified the 19th Amendment more than 5 months after it became law and after women voted in the 1920 election. Why was there a delay between the adoption and the ratification in Vermont?
Well, after Congress approved the amendment in June of 1919, the requirement was that 36 states, or 3/4 of the states, had to ratify the amendment. And so Vermont legislators were not in session. They had already finished their 1919 session, and they were not scheduled to be back in session in those years until 2 years later in 1921. So it required the Governor Percival Clement, to call them into special session. And there was a tremendous effort to do that. The organization, the Vermont Equal Suffrage Organization, rounded up women all over the state to sign petitions and letters. They went out and got the legislators to pressure the governor and to pledge to come back into special session, which they they wanted to do. And then the governor continued to resist. He was a strong opponent against suffrage and also against prohibition, which was the other hot issue at that time. And he refused to do it. So the women mounted perhaps the largest protest in Vermont history to date. They gathered in Montpelier down and walked down State Street and pressured him, but he failed to be moved.
Right. So before we get to, we'll go back up with that Beard. Edna Beard was, I mean, the 1920 election happened and women did vote. So it didn't complicate the process. This was our first woman ever legislator, right? Legislator.
Right after the ratification was done, women registered, only over 28,000 women registered, and they helped to elect both the new governor, who was pro-suffrage, and this woman, Edna Beard. And she was a very important first woman in the legislature. She got lots of attention. But most importantly, more than that, she was first. She actually introduced some new legislation for women that expanded the small welfare payments for women, and also required county sheriffs to appoint deputies, to appoint a woman as deputy. So she began making a difference for women.
I guess so. And so let's just step back a bit around the movement, the suffrage movement in Vermont. Who were some key activists, and what arguments did they make to convince men in power that women should vote?
Well, the first woman who initiated the campaign was Clarissa Howard Nichols. Now that was back in mid-1840s. And there she is. She was the first woman to stand in front of the legislature. She had been advocating for married women's property rights, and now she was before them demanding that she be allowed to vote in school meetings. Now, her argument was interesting. Rather than equality, which was the dominant argument at the time, she argued that she needed the vote because she was a mother. She needed to protect her children and her own interest. And after all, if women were educating and protecting children, they needed to oversee the schools. So that was her argument. But of course, she was quickly dismissed, and she went on and actually moved to Kansas. Now, a very different kind of activist was Lucy Daniels. Now, here we were 60 years later, and Lucy Daniels, as you can see, was a radical. And she was interested in protesting, not in persuading like Nichols. So she protested by marching in parades, refusing to pay her taxes, writing a great big sign on her barn that said, "A square deal, votes for Vermont women." And then here we have in the next slide, she was protesting in Washington in front of the president's house. President Wilson was not supporting suffrage strongly. And so the women of the National Party, including Lucy Daniels from Vermont, were out there demanding, Mr. President, what about American women? How long will they have to wait for liberty? And went to jail for doing that many times. So she was quite different from Clarissa Nichols.
So quickly, what were the opponents' arguments in resisting or rejecting these demands for equal rights at the ballot box?
Well, actually, it's very interesting. There were women also who did not want to vote, as well as the men did not want to give them the power to vote. Both groups believed that women did not belong in politics. They called it in the very early days the dirty pool of politics, and then they proceeded to ridicule any woman who would go into politics, claiming that she was trying to wear the pants. The other argument was, of course, the religious argument that the Bible dictated that women had a sacred duty to raise children and to be homemakers, which was the belief at that time. And the Vermont men were often resistant by saying, well, the women in their towns didn't want to vote. Well, there were some women who didn't want to vote, and they organized the Vermont League opposed to suffrage. and claimed that if they were allowed to vote, it would really besmirch their strong female influence in morality and respectability, and that therefore they would no longer be protected by their men, and they didn't want to have any part of it.
So
they were a minority.
Yeah. Very quickly, how does the Vermont movement compare to other regions in the states?
Well, there were two main things. Here we have a map that the women used to show that out in the West, the women were voting. 11 states had already passed suffrage when Vermont men finally allowed tax-paying women to vote in town meeting only. And New York had passed presidential suffrage. The other thing was that the Vermont movement was very much comprised of white middle-class women and was not diverse like the rest of the movement, which was filled with women from all races and classes. There were Union women, African-American women, Asian women, and that was not so true of Vermont.
In Vermont. So Sandy, quickly, we have less than a minute. Why was the history of the women's suffrage so timely for today?
Well, providing the opportunity for all citizens to vote has been a work in progress since the beginning of our country. Unfortunately, only pretty much upper class or middle class and educated women got to vote, white women, in 1920. And there's been a lot of movement since then. But even today, there are efforts to suppress the right to vote. Even stringent ID requirements to register, or not having enough polling places, or too few people at the polling places.
So unfortunately, we are all out of time. These are all so important, especially today, I think. And you can learn more at vtsuffrage2020.org. You can also find them on Facebook and Instagram at vtsuffrage2020. You'll find about plays that will come up, other wonderful events that are happening. So thank you both to Marilyn and Sandra for joining us today. We hope that you check it out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.